Supercar Trans Am, or American Turbo-King as it was later called, was made in 1989 by Supersonic Software. Codemasters published the game for the ZX Spectrum. It was originally released as part of the Cheater Defender bundle, together with 5 other games. Virgin Mastertronic re-released the game with additional support for the Magnum Light phaser, keyboard and joystick as a standalone title. At this time, a port for the Amstrad CPC followed. Most scenes shown in this review originate from the ZX Spectrum version. It's unclear why the original title was dropped. Possibly the Sports Car Club of America was unhappy by the way their Trans-American Championship could be related to the destructivity displayed in the game. Another explanation is that there possibly was a disagreement with Pontiac. The loading screen shows a Firebird model Trans Am, which was later dropped for the Amstrad CPC release. The car also isn't featured on the cover of the Mastertronic re-release. In the game's story, the player participates in a brutal death race across the United States of America. This race concludes in New York, where a prize is waiting. The player steals the car by shooting the 2 arrows at the top of the screen. To change into reverse gear, the player has to shoot the car itself. The goal of the game is to reach the finish line before the timer at the bottom right runs out. Per level, 3 chances are offered. The player has to avoid obstacles by driving around them or by jumping over ramps. Some trails lead into a dead end. Therefore, each track has to be memorized carefully. If the player drives through water, the engine gets waterlogged and the car is unable to continue. During the race, hostile cars, airplanes and helicopters try to kill the player. These enemies can be shot with the light gun. There are 5 levels: California Beach, a pass in the Rocky Mountains, the Grand Canyon, the so-called Great Lakes area, and New York. At the beginning of each stage, the stock of lives is reset to 3. If the player dies, a life is consumed, and the player is put a few steps in front of the same spot in order to continue. If the time runs out, a life is deducted and the level starts over. When all lives are used up, the player can enter the name into a scoreboard and is put back to the start screen. The Amstrad CPC version of the game is more colorful than the original, and in it objects are easier distinguishable from the background. Furthermore, in the Amstrad version the sounds are more elaborate. Sadly, this version controls much worse and therefore is much more difficult. In both versions, the hitboxes feel too big and seem to be misplaced sometimes, but on the CPC this seems to be more of an issue. Apparently, the game runs slower on the Amstrad, which further lessens the appeal of this version. Personally, I like Supercar Trans Am. It is my least favorite game of the Cheater Defender bundle, but I still had fun beating it. I think it's great that the developers tried to make a non-conventional light gun game and tried something more creative and unusual. In my opinion, the game is mostly held back by its clunky controls and the unreasonable hitboxes. The music is good and the graphics look neat. Many publications falsely credit the graphics of the game to Chris Graham, but in reality they were done by Neil Adamson. In the book Sinclair ZX Spectrum, a Visual Compendium, Neil talks about his humble beginnings as a freelancer for Codemasters. He lived very far away from the company. Thus he used to save his work onto audio tape and send them by mail to Codemasters. Neil preferred to draw on a black and white TV screen as he experienced the pixels as being sharper there. He drew on a piece of cling film first, which he then taped onto the screen in order to trace it with his ZX Spectrum 48K. The cover of the re-release shows a futuristic looking fantasy car as it speeds through the desert. It's very well drawn and I like it a lot. This is the end of the review. My name is Ben. I thank you for viewing.